Grandma Ruth was 89 years old, lying in a hospice bed in her own living room, her breathing slow and shallow, when she reached out with a trembling hand and asked for her grandson, Josh, one last time. Josh hadn't spoken to his grandmother in almost 2 years. He'd walked away from the family, from faith, from nearly everything Ruth had spent her life trying to instill in him, and everyone in the family had quietly stopped expecting him to show up for much of anything anymore, including this. But somehow, that afternoon, he did. He walked into that living room looking like a man who had aged 10 years since anyone had last seen him, sat down beside his grandmother's bed, and took her frail hand in his. Ruth, with what little strength she had left, pulled him close, and prayed one final prayer over him, a prayer so specific, so filled with detail about a future Josh couldn't possibly imagine for himself at that moment, that everyone in the room would remember every single word of it for years to come. 3 days later, Ruth passed away peacefully. But the prayer she prayed over her grandson that afternoon was only just beginning to unfold. This is Josh's story. Josh had grown up incredibly close to his grandmother. After his parents' difficult divorce when he was 10, Ruth had become the steady, unwavering presence in his life, the one who showed up to every school event, who prayed over him every single night he stayed with her, who taught him scripture verses at her kitchen table while baking cookies on Saturday afternoons. If anyone had shaped the foundation of Josh's early faith, it was Ruth. But by his early 20s, Josh's life had taken a hard turn. A series of bad decisions, a toxic relationship, and a growing dependency on alcohol had slowly pulled him away from the family that loved him and the faith that had once anchored him. He stopped answering calls. He stopped coming to holidays. The version of Josh that showed up on the rare occasions his family did see him felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face, guarded, defensive, clearly ashamed, but unwilling to admit it. Ruth had never stopped praying for him, even as the distance between them grew wider. Family members would later say she prayed for Josh by name every single day, without fail, for the entire 2 years he'd been gone, refusing to give up hope even as everyone else in the family quietly began to. When Ruth's health began declining rapidly that final month, the family reached out to Josh, uncertain if he'd respond at all. 4 days, there was silence. But some pull he couldn't fully explain even to himself, brought him to that living room on what would become one of the last coherent afternoons of his grandmother's life. He sat down beside her bed that day carrying 2 years of shame and distance, uncertain what to say, uncertain if he even deserved to be in that room after everything he'd put his family through. Ruth, weak but lucid, looked at her grandson with an expression Josh later described as somehow both heartbroken and full of unshakable hope at the exact same time. She reached for his hand, and though her voice had grown faint over the previous days, it grew steady and clear as she began to pray. Jesus, I have prayed for this boy every single day since he left, and I am not going to stop now, even from here. I know you have not given up on him, even in the days when he gave up on himself. I am asking you, right now, to finish the work in him that I won't be here to see with my own eyes. Bring him all the way back, Lord. Not part way. All the way. Use every hard thing he's walked through to build something in him that can't be shaken again. Give him a wife who loves you. Give him children he'll raise the way I tried to raise him. Use his story, every broken piece of it, to bring other people back to you the way you're bringing him back right now. I release him into your hands, completely, because I trust you more than I trust my own ability to watch over him. Josh says he broke down completely somewhere in the middle of that prayer, decades of guilt and shame finally cracking open, sobbing at his grandmother's bedside in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Ruth simply held his hand through it, praying quietly over him until her strength finally gave out, and she drifted into a peaceful sleep. That was the last real conversation Josh ever had with his grandmother. She passed away 3 days later, surrounded by family, peaceful and ready, the way people who describe her often say she lived her entire life. Josh says something in him shifted permanently that afternoon in his grandmother's living room, even though the full transformation didn't happen overnight. Grief, he says, has a strange way of stripping away every excuse a person has been hiding behind, and in the weeks following Ruth's funeral, Josh found himself unable to keep running from everything her prayer had spoken directly into his life. He checked himself into a recovery program 6 weeks later, the first real step toward the sobriety he'd been avoiding for years. He started attending the same small church Ruth had faithfully attended her entire life, sitting in the same pew she used to sit in, surrounded by people who had known and loved her, people who welcomed Josh with a grace he says he didn't feel he deserved but received anyway. Over the following 2 years, piece by piece, the specific details of Ruth's final prayer began unfolding in ways that left Josh and his entire family in stunned, humbled awe. He met a woman at that small church, Christy, whose own faith and steady character reminded family members instantly of the kind of partner Ruth had always prayed her grandson would find. They married 18 months later. Josh, sober and rebuilding his life piece by piece, became active in the church's recovery ministry, sharing his own story openly with other men walking through the exact struggles that had once nearly destroyed him. 2 years after Ruth's passing, Josh and Christy welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Ruth in honor of the grandmother whose final prayer had set this entire chain of events into motion. Josh says he reads that child a Bible story every single night, the same way his grandmother used to read to him, determined to carry forward exactly what Ruth had spent her life pouring into him. I didn't understand what was happening in that room the day she prayed over me, Josh says. I just knew I was falling apart, and she was praying like she somehow already knew exactly how the story was going to end. Looking back now, I think she did know. I think God had already shown her, and she was simply speaking it out loud so I'd have something to hold onto once she was gone. Josh's family says they've never forgotten a single word of that prayer, largely because they watched it unfold, piece by piece, with an accuracy that felt impossible to attribute to mere coincidence. The wife who loves God deeply. The children being raised in faith. The story of brokenness now actively being used to reach other men walking through addiction. Every single detail Ruth spoke over her grandson, in what would become one of her final coherent conversations, has come to pass, exactly as she prayed it. Josh's mother, Ruth's daughter, says she keeps a small notebook where she wrote down her mother's prayer word for word the same evening it happened, unable to shake the feeling even then that she was witnessing something she needed to preserve. She's since shared that notebook with Josh, who keeps it in a drawer beside his bed, rereading it on hard days, as a reminder of exactly how far God has carried him since that afternoon in his grandmother's living room. Josh speaks now at his church's recovery ministry meetings with a quiet, steady conviction that comes from having lived through every word of his grandmother's prayer firsthand. He tells the men in that room, many of them carrying the same shame and distance he once carried, that it is never too late for someone else's faithful prayers to reach you, even prayers spoken by someone who won't be here to see the answer with their own eyes. My grandmother believed in a version of me that I couldn't even see in myself at the time, Josh says. She prayed for the man I am today 2 years before I became him. That's not something I take lightly. That's not something I'll ever stop being grateful for. Maybe someone has been praying for you for a long time, faithfully, quietly, refusing to give up even as you've drifted further and further from the person they remember. Maybe, like Josh, you felt too far gone, too ashamed, too broken to believe those prayers could ever actually reach you or change anything about the direction your life is heading. Josh's story is a beautiful reminder that faithful prayer doesn't have an expiration date, and it doesn't require the person praying to live long enough to see the answer with their own eyes. Ruth prayed a detailed, specific, hope-filled prayer over her grandson in one of the final conversations of her life, and God honored every single word of it, long after she was gone. If you have someone in your life you've been praying for without seeing any visible change, don't stop. You may never know, this side of eternity, exactly how much your faithfulness is planting seeds that will bloom long after you've stopped watching for them. And if you're the one who has drifted, the one who feels too far gone for anyone's prayers to matter anymore, know that someone's faithful prayer may be working on your behalf in ways you can't yet see, preparing a future for you that feels impossible from where you're currently standing. Sometimes the most powerful prayer isn't the one that gets answered instantly. Sometimes it's the one spoken in someone's final days, that takes years to fully unfold, and changes an entire family's story forever, one faithful word at a time.